She had come to a place no one believed could shelter a living soul. Then something arrived out of the storm that no one should have survived. Outside, in weather that had already killed horses, someone was still knocking.
This man had mocked everything she built. And she had gone out into that blizzard anyway.
The sound a door latch makes when it closes for the last time is nothing like what you expect. It is not a slam. It is not a crash. It is a small, clean click, the kind a person might make with their tongue, the kind that dissolves in the morning air before the echo has any chance to form. Vesper Calloway heard that sound at first light on the 14th of September, 1883, and she did not turn around. The porch boards were cold through the soles of her boots. The sky above Carbon County was the particular shade of gray that comes just before the sun commits to rising, a thin pewter light that made the scrub brush look silver and the distant peaks look painted rather than real. She stood with her back to the house, a worn canvas sack hanging from her left shoulder, and she breathed the air that smelled of dry grass and something faintly bitter, like iron left out overnight. The house behind her was her father's house. It had never been hers in any way that mattered. In her left coat pocket, she carried $17. 6 bills and an assortment of coins she had counted 4 times in the dark before dawn, as if the number might change. It had not changed. $17 was the arithmetic of her situation, clean and final. In her right coat pocket, folded along lines that had softened from handling, was a single sheet of paper pressed into her hand at the reading of her grandmother's effects 3 weeks prior. The lawyer had set it aside from the rest, almost apologetically, and slid it across the table toward her, while her uncle pocketed the deed to the grain store without looking up. The paper described a parcel of land in Carbon County, Wyoming Territory. Section 14 of the Hollow Rock Claim. Her grandmother's name, Elspeth May Calloway, was written at the top in ink that had faded to the color of old tea. Her father had said nothing when she packed her things. He had stood in the kitchen doorway while she moved through the small bedroom she had occupied since childhood, folding her 2 dresses, wrapping her tinderbox in a wool stocking, sliding her pocket knife into her boot. He was not a cruel man. He was a man made entirely of calculations, and the calculation he had made that autumn, in the wake of a failed wheat crop and a broken wagon axle, was that 1 fewer mouth represented a measurable improvement in his odds. He had said, his voice carrying neither warmth nor contempt, only the flat register of a man stating a fact he has already accepted, that a woman grown makes her own way. He had said it the way a person might note that winter follows autumn. There was no point arguing with the season. She had not argued. The walk into Harlan Flats was 4 miles along a rutted track that ran between 2 long ridges of pale stone. The wind came down from the northwest in the mornings, and it had teeth already, a reminder that September in Wyoming was not a gentle month. Vesper kept her pace steady, not hurrying, because there was no reward for arriving somewhere sooner when you had no particular welcome waiting. She passed the Hendricks homestead, dark and shuttered. She passed the old relay station that had not been used since the telegraph lines went in. She passed a stand of cottonwoods that had shed most of their leaves, their white bark standing stark against the brown hillside, and she thought, without quite meaning to, that they looked like bones. She pushed the thought away and kept walking. Harlan Flats was the kind of town that had arrived on the territory maps before it had entirely decided what it wanted to be. There was a livery, a land office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and Morrow's General Store, which served as the commercial and social center of the county in roughly equal measure. Silas Morrow had run the store for 18 years. He knew the price of everything within 3 counties and the financial condition of most families within 1. He was not unkind, but his assessments were precise, and precision, in Vesper's experience, could feel a great deal like dismissal. The bell above the door announced her arrival. The store smelled of cured meat and coffee and the particular dusty sweetness of dry goods stored in burlap. 2 men stood at the far end of the counter, and one of them was Cutter Hayes, who trapped beaver and mink along the creek systems to the north, and came into town every few weeks to sell pelts and spend the proceeds on coffee and conversation in roughly equal measure. He was a lean, weathered man of about 40, with a jaw that moved constantly on a piece of dried tobacco, and eyes that missed very little. He glanced at Vesper the way a person glances at something they have already categorized and set aside. Silas Morrow came in from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was a broad man with a careful face, the kind of face that had learned over decades to give away only as much as the situation required. He looked at Vesper, then at the paper she set on the counter, and he picked it up and held it at arm's length the way men of a certain age hold documents when they have not yet admitted they need spectacles. He set it back down. The Hollow Rock Claim. He took his time with the words, turning them over as if testing their weight. Section 14. He folded his hands on the counter. Your grandmother's parcel. Vesper confirmed that it was. I knew your grandmother. His voice was measured, the tone of a man about to deliver news he has delivered before. She was a sensible woman in most respects. He tapped the paper once. This land is not sensible. It is all rock face and ravine out there. No surface water to speak of. The soil where there is soil runs shallow, maybe 2 inches before you hit granite shelf. Nobody has ever found a productive use for it. He paused. There's a cave in the cliff face, if I recall correctly. Something of a local curiosity. But a curiosity is not a homestead. From the far end of the counter, Cutter Hayes did not look up from his coffee. That cave's good for one thing. He shifted the tobacco to the other cheek. Rattlesnakes like the shade. First hard winter will put her in the ground right alongside them. Vesper did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Silas Morrow and told him what she needed. A good axe, one that would hold an edge and balance well in the hand. A bow saw. 50 pounds of flour. A salt block. Whatever dried beans the remainder would purchase. Rope. Silas Morrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his pencil and the brown paper he kept for calculations. He wrote the figures in a column, totaled them, and turned the paper so she could read it. The number at the bottom would take everything she had. She pushed the coins and bills across the counter. He did not try again to change her mind. He packed her supplies with the methodical efficiency of a man who has learned that argument is a luxury neither other party in a transaction can usually afford. The axe he wrapped in burlap. The flour he double-sacked. He weighed out the beans more than she had expected and tied the sack with a length of cord. Dorothea Morrow appeared from somewhere in the back of the store while her husband was loading the second sack of flour. She was a woman of perhaps 48, quieter than her husband, with the kind of stillness about her that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having learned exactly when to say it. She moved to the near end of the counter and stood there for a moment, and then, without any particular ceremony, she pressed something into the side pocket of Vesper's coat. Vesper felt the small, dense weight of it. She had no time to ask before Dorothea had already moved back toward the storeroom, and Silas was setting the rope coil on top of the packed canvas, and Cutter Hayes was watching from his stool with an expression that was almost curiosity before it settled back into something more familiar. Vesper lifted the pack, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and walked out through the door. The bell rang once behind her. A half-mile outside of town, when the store was out of sight, she reached into her pocket and found a small cloth packet tied with kitchen string. She worked the knot loose with her thumbnail and folded the cloth back. 2 varieties, from the look of them, one type darker and rounder, one lighter and tapered. She could not identify them with certainty at that distance from any garden, but she thought she recognized the shape of one as carrot. The other might have been kale. She wrapped them carefully back in the cloth and put the packet into the inside pocket of her coat, closer to her chest, where the cold could not reach them. She had no idea yet why Dorothea Morrow had done this. She would not understand it for several months, but she kept walking. The first day's travel took her along established wagon tracks that grew less established as the afternoon wore on. By midday, the ruts were shallow suggestions rather than roads, and by mid-afternoon there were no ruts at all, only deer trails and the natural geography of the land expressing itself without any human correction. The soil changed color as she moved south and west, going from the brown loam of the valley floor to a redder, stonier composition, and then to pale gray where the granite shelf pushed close to the surface. The vegetation thinned. The cottonwoods had given way to scrub juniper, and then to sagebrush, and then to very little at all except for the occasional tough grass growing in low places where moisture collected. She made camp that night in the lee of a rock formation that blocked the northwest wind, building a small fire from the dried juniper she gathered in the last hour of light. The fire burned hot and short, the way juniper does, and smelled clean. She ate a cold biscuit she had carried from the house and drank from her canteen and listened to the silence, which was not actually silence at all, but a layered assembly of small sounds: the tick of cooling rock, the distant complaint of a nighthawk, the wind moving across the open ground above her shelter. She counted her remaining coins twice and then put them away. In the morning she was stiff and colder than she had expected, and she ate walking to warm herself, finishing the last of what she had carried from home. The land grew harder as she went. The granite pushed up through the soil like the backs of old animals, smooth and impersonal, covered in patches of gray-green lichen that had been growing there since before any human being had thought to name the territory. She was above 4,000 feet now, she estimated, and the air had a quality to it, thin and direct, that made distances difficult to judge. A ridge that looked close would require an hour to reach. A gap in the rock wall ahead might open into a wide canyon or into a narrow slot 10 feet deep. The country did not announce itself. She almost walked past it. She had been looking for a cliff face, as the land description suggested, and she found it in the mid-afternoon of the second day. A sheer wall of granite rising perhaps 60 feet from the broken ground at its base, stretching north and south for a quarter-mile before the canyon it formed bent away out of sight. The gray was interrupted by darker lines where water had once run down the face, long ago, leaving mineral stains the color of rust. At the base of the wall, set back slightly under a natural overhang, was an opening in the rock. Vesper stopped and looked at it. It was not dramatic as cave entrances go. It was wider than it was tall, perhaps 6 feet across and 4 feet high at the center, meaning a person of her height would have to duck to enter. The edges of the opening were rounded by time and water rather than sharp and broken, which suggested the cave had been forming for a very long time. The ground in front of it was clear of debris in a way that seemed almost deliberate, a flat apron of fine gravel that might have been placed there by intention if she had not already understood that intention had nothing to do with anything in this landscape. She set her pack down and took out her tinder box. She struck a spark and caught it in a small wad of dried grass, blew it into a flame, and transferred it to a short piece of juniper branch she had carried in her pack for this purpose. Then she ducked under the lip of the cave entrance and stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was not warm, not in any way she would have called warmth if she were comfortable, but it was still. The wind, which had been a continuous presence for 2 days, pressing at her back, pulling at her hat brim, simply ceased to exist the moment she was inside the rock. The temperature was cool but even, the kind of even that suggests the space has been insulated from the daily cycle of heating and cooling by the sheer mass of stone surrounding it. She stood inside the entrance and felt the stillness against her face, the way she might have felt the absence of a sound she had grown accustomed to. The tunnel entrance was short. Within 20 steps it opened into a larger space, a vaulted chamber perhaps 30 feet across and 15 feet high at the center of the dome. Her small torch pushed back enough darkness to show her the walls, which were smooth granite, shaped by ancient water rather than fracture, without the sharp angles of blasted rock. The floor was sand and fine gravel, dry without the dampness she had expected. She scuffed at it with her boot and found it dry 3 inches down. She moved deeper. The torch threw long shadows across the far wall of the chamber, and she followed them. And it was in the far corner, where the chamber narrowed into a secondary alcove barely large enough to stand in, that she heard it, a sound that was not silence. Slow and steady, and patient, like the ticking of a very deliberate clock. She moved toward it, holding the torch lower, watching where she stepped. In a narrow fissure in the back wall of the alcove, water moved. Not a stream, not a flow in any conventional sense, but a seep, the slow migration of groundwater through fractured granite, emerging from the rock face one drop at a time and falling a distance of perhaps 8 inches into a shallow basin the stone had worn for itself over more centuries than she could usefully think about. Basin held perhaps 2 inches of water. She crouched and touched the surface with her fingertip, then brought her finger to her lips. Clean. Cold without being sharp. Without the mineral taste of bad well water or the flat chemical smell of standing water. Simply clean, the way spring water is clean, the way rain is clean before it touches anything human-made. She set the torch in a crack in the wall where it would stand without assistance and pressed both palms flat against the stone beside the seep. The rock held a temperature that was neither the cold of the outside air nor the warmth of a heated room. It was something in between, the memory of last summer still present in the thermal mass of the stone, a buffer against the season that was coming, a natural moderator. She had heard her grandmother speak once about root cellars and the principle behind them, how the earth at a certain depth stopped participating in the drama of the seasons and held its own counsel. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. She picked up the torch and moved it along the wall of the alcove, illuminating the stone in sections, examining the surface. Most of it was undifferentiated granite, ancient and smooth. Near the base of the wall to the right of the seep, at a height that would require a person to crouch, 3 marks had been cut into the stone. Not scratched, not accidental, but deliberate, made with something metal applied with patience. The marks were not deep, perhaps a 1/16 of an inch, but in the torchlight they were unmistakable. EMC 3 letters. Her grandmother's initials, Vesper May Calloway, who had died in her bed in October and left behind almost nothing except a land deed for a piece of ground everyone agreed was worthless. Vesper lowered herself onto the dry sand floor and sat with her back against the cool wall, the torch burning steadily in its crack, the water marking its steady count in the corner. The letters were at her eye level from this position. Someone had sat in approximately this same spot, against this same wall, and taken the time to cut her name into the stone. Not as a claim exactly, not a boast. Something more like a signature. A woman had been here, in this specific place, and had made a mark that said, "I was here. I sat where you are sitting. I understood what you now understand." A woman grown makes her own way, her father's words. She had taken them as a dismissal when he spoke them, because that was how they had been offered, with no warmth behind them, only arithmetic. But sitting in the dark of the cave with her grandmother's initials cut into the rock beside her, She turned the words over again and found that they had more than one shape. A woman grown makes her own way. It was also a description of what Vesper Calloway had done here, in this cave, in 1867, or whenever it was that she had sat in this exact spot with a knife and made her mark. It was also a description of what was about to be required of Vesper herself. She stayed in the cave long enough for the torch to burn halfway down. Then she went back out into the late afternoon light and looked at the cliff face, the overhang, the apron of flat gravel, and the surrounding terrain. She did not look at it as a curiosity or a shelter of last resort. She looked at it as a person looks at a problem they have decided to solve. The timber she needed was a quarter-mile down the ravine, a stand of lodgepole pine growing where a seasonal creek provided enough moisture to sustain them. She could see the dark green of their tops from where she stood. The stone for a foundation was present in abundance at the base of the cliff and in the bed of the ravine itself. The gravel apron in front of the cave entrance would compact to a serviceable floor if she brought additional material to fill the low spots. The cave itself would serve as the back wall and thermal mass of any structure she built against it, meaning she would need to construct only 3 walls and a roof to create an enclosed living space. The cave entrance could become an interior doorway once the front wall was built. She had the tools, she had the material, she had the location. What she had was also this, the certainty, sitting in her chest like a warm coal, that her grandmother had known exactly what she was leaving and exactly to whom she was leaving it, and had done so in the full confidence that the person who received it would have the wit to understand what it was. She went back to her pack, pulled out the axe, and took off her coat. She had never felled a tree. She had watched her father do it twice, once to clear a field margin, and once to salvage a dead elm for firewood, and she had paid the kind of attention that comes from already knowing she might need to do this herself someday. She remembered the principle: a notch cut on the side you want the tree to fall toward, then a back cut slightly above the base of the notch on the opposite side. The notch controls the direction. The back cut releases the tree from its own weight. The angle matters. Her first attempt went wrong in a way she should have anticipated. The notch was too shallow and the back cut met it at the wrong height, which meant the tree, a lodgepole perhaps 8 inches in diameter, did not fall toward the notch but rather sat pinched on the saw blade, holding itself by a hinge of wood too thick to collapse cleanly. She withdrew the saw, found a stout branch on the ground nearby, drove it into the cut as a wedge, and pushed. The tree groaned and shifted, and finally went over with a crack that echoed off the cliff face, falling approximately where she had wanted it, which was good enough for a first attempt. The second tree went better. The third was better still. By the end of the first afternoon, she had 5 trees down, limbed with the axe, the branches piled to one side for later use as kindling. The trunks lay on the ground like a promise she had made to herself. Her hands were already blistering despite the calluses she had developed from farm work, and her right shoulder ached from the unfamiliar motion of the axe. She wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from the hem of her second dress, ate a double handful of raw beans from the sack, drank from her canteen, and built a small fire at the mouth of the cave. The night that followed was the first night she slept inside the cave, on the sand floor with her coat over her and her boots still on. The temperature inside was significantly warmer than the outside air, which had dropped to something near freezing by midnight. She woke once, heard the wind above the cave entrance and the slow water in the back alcove, and went back to sleep. In the morning her hands were stiff, but her shoulder had loosened during sleep. She ate a thin porridge of flour and water cooked over the rebuilt fire, and looked at the 5 logs lying in the ravine. Moving them to the building site was a problem of different dimensions than felling them. A lodgepole 8 inches in diameter and 12 feet long weighs more than 200 pounds, and 200 pounds is not a weight she could lift, haul, or drag efficiently over rough ground for a quarter mile. She had to think her way to an answer instead. She cut a series of 4-inch rounds from smaller deadwood and laid them on the ground in front of the first log at intervals of about 3 feet. Rollers. She levered the log up at one end with a branch used as a pry bar, slid the first roller under, repeated the process at the other end, and found that the log, once elevated on the rounds, moved with a pressure she could sustain. It required constant repositioning of the rollers, moving the ones that had passed to the front, maintaining the line. It required her to stop every 20 minutes and rest, but it worked. By midday, she had 2 logs at the building site. By the end of the 3rd day, she had all 12. The foundation took another 2 days. She selected flat stones from the ravine bed, the largest she could carry alone, and laid them in a rectangle 12 of her paces long and 8 of her paces wide, with the cave entrance at the approximate center of the long back wall. She leveled the stones as well as she could by feel and eye, using fine sand as a shim material where the stone surfaces did not sit flush. A frontier cabin built by one person under time pressure was not a finished house and was not required to be. It was required to stand through a Wyoming winter and keep the weather out. Those were the specifications she was building toward. The walls went up log by log, each one its own small engineering exercise. She rigged a simple hoist from her rope and the sturdiest branch she could find, lashing the rope through a notch in the wood to form a crude block, anchoring the upper end to a spike she drove into a crack in the cliff face, and using her own weight as counterbalance to lift each timber, end enough to seat it in the notch she had cut in the corner log below. It was not elegant. Several times the rope slipped or the timber swung, and she had to start the lift again. Once a log rolled off the wall entirely when she had it almost in position, and it landed 3 feet from where she was standing, and she stood there with her heart hammering and her hands shaking for a full minute before she moved. She kept building. The gaps between the logs she packed with a mixture she made from the sandy clay she dug out of the ravine bed, water from the seep, and dried grass cut and shredded with her knife. She forced the mixture into every gap with her fingers, smoothing it on both sides, pressing it deep into the spaces where cold air would otherwise find a way through. It dried in the October air within a day, shrinking slightly as it cured. She went over the walls twice, finding the gaps that had opened in the shrinkage and packing them again. The roof was pine poles laid across the top of the walls at intervals, with smaller branches filling the spaces between them, and over that a layer of the clay mixture. It was not a finished roof in any conventional sense, but it was a barrier that would shed water and hold heat. The fireplace was the most technically demanding part. She identified a section of the cliff face to the left of the cave entrance that was solid granite without visible fractures, which would hold heat without the risk of spalling in the fire. She built the firebox from flat stones mortared with the clay mixture, making the opening wide enough to take full-length logs, then built the flue in a narrow column against the rock face with a natural gap in the cliff's upper edge that she had noticed when studying the wall from below. The first fire she lit in it filled the cabin with smoke, and she went outside and stood in the cold and felt the particular anger of a person who has worked hard and built something that does not yet work. She went back in, eyes stinging, and studied the flue. The problem was the angle of the upper flue section was directing the rising air back toward the cabin, rather than up and out. She rebuilt the top 3 courses of the flue with the stones angled differently, narrowing toward the top. She lit the fire again. The smoke went up. It went up cleanly, decisively, and the heat that had previously been escaping with it now stayed in the room, spreading from the firebox and radiating from the stone cliff wall behind it. Within an hour, the cabin was warmer than she had been since leaving her father's house. She sat on the floor with her back against the opposite wall and felt the heat reach her and said nothing to no one, because there was no one to say anything to. And sometimes the right response to a thing working is just to let it work. She turned her attention then to the cave itself. She spent 3 days carrying soil into the cave from a pocket of rich dark earth she discovered in a sheltered bend of the ravine, where years of leaf fall and organic material had accumulated to a depth of nearly a foot. She fashioned a bucket from bent pine bark waterproofed with pine pitch, carrying load after load through the cabin and into the cave, building raised beds against the walls of the front section of the chamber, where the ambient light from the cave entrance and the cabin doorway created a dim but real illumination for perhaps 6 hours each day. The beds were framed with stone, and the soil she added was deep, 6 inches at minimum, mixed with handfuls of organic material from the ravine floor. She watered them from the seep, carrying water in a cut section of pine bark that served adequately as a vessel for short distances. Into these beds she pressed the seeds Dorothea Morrow had given her. She still did not know exactly what they were, but she pressed them in at a depth that felt appropriate for something root-forming, covered them, pressed the soil down, and watered them, and waited. The remainder of the cave she divided with a fence of woven saplings, thin lodgepole branches stripped of bark and woven together, 2 feet high, sufficient to contain the small animals she was planning to acquire, but had not yet the means to obtain. She was running out of supplies. The flour was below half. The beans were still adequate, but not indefinitely. The work she was doing burned more than a diet of thin porridge could replenish, and she could feel it in the way her clothes were fitting differently, looser across the shoulders. She had to go back to Harlan Flats. The return walk took a day and a half. When she came through the door of Morrow's general store, the bell rang as it always did, and Silas Morrow looked up from behind the counter, and the expression that crossed his face was not quite what she had seen in the first time. Something had shifted in it. Something had recalibrated. Cutter Hayes was there again, in the same position he had occupied before, looking at her with slightly more attention than he had given her the first time, his jaw slowing on the tobacco. There was a woman near the dry goods shelves who glanced at Vesper and then looked away with the particular studied neutrality of someone who has already formed an opinion and decided not to share it today. Vesper set her remaining money on the counter and told Silas what she needed. 4 laying hens, a pair of sheep, a ewe and a ram, young enough to be manageable but old enough to have passed the fragility of early life. A further quantity of salt. He heard her out without interrupting. Then he looked at the money on the counter. From behind her, Cutter Hayes made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You're buying livestock to put in a cave. That's what you're telling us." He shifted in his seat. "Sheep will be dead before Christmas, hens too likely. Cold out there, we'll see to it. Silas Morrow tallied the figures on his paper, turned it to show her the total, which was nearly everything she had put on the counter, and her expression did not change. She nodded. Silas Morrow looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he packed the salt and went to speak to his man about the animals. The woman near the dry goods had stopped pretending to look at fabric and was watching openly. Outside the window, 2 men passing on the street paused and looked through the glass at the small procession forming, Vesper accepting the rope leads for the sheep, taking the crated hens under her arm. She stepped out through the door into the sharp October afternoon and began the walk back out of town. She did not look at the windows. She did not look at the men on the boardwalk. She kept her eyes on the road west, and her steps even, because what other people believed about her odds was information that did not belong in the calculations she was making. The cold coming off the northwest ridge was harder than it had been a week ago. The smell of it different, the kind of cold that has iron in it rather than just wind. The Wyoming winter did not negotiate. It arrived on its own schedule and stayed until it decided to leave, and the only relevant question for any person in its path was what kind of structure they had built to wait it out. She knew what kind of structure she had built. The journey back with the animals was slow and physically demanding in ways the solo walk had not been, the sheep requiring constant guidance over the rough terrain, the hens in their crates shifting their weight unpredictably. She arrived at the cave entrance in the gray last light of the second day, exhausted in a way that went past her muscles and settled somewhere in the deeper tissue of her persistence. She brought the animals through the cabin and into the cave. The sheep, who had been agitated since the sheep pen at Morrow's, went still almost immediately inside the cave. The air in there, with its constant temperature and absence of wind, was not what they were accustomed to, but it was not hostile. And animals that have been cold and uncomfortable know stillness when they find it. The hens, once released from the crate into the pen she had woven for them, began to peck at the ground with the focused purpose of hens the world over. Vesper sat down on the dry sand floor of the cave and listened to the animals settling around her and the water finding its way down the back wall and the distant sound of the wind, which reached the inside of the cave as nothing more than a low, occasional moan, more felt than heard, a reminder of a world outside this rock that was operating on different terms. She was warmer than she would have been anywhere else on Section 14 of the Hollow Rock Claim, Wyoming Territory, on the 14th of October, 1883. She was warmer than a girl with $17 had any reason to expect to be. She was exactly as warm as a person who had understood what this place was and had done the work to make use of that understanding deserved to be. Outside, the wind was climbing. She could hear it now above the cave, running along the top of the cliff face with a sound like water over stone. The first hard cold of the season was making its intentions known. Inside the cave, the sheep breathed slowly. The hens had gone quiet on their roost. Vesper pressed her hand flat against the granite wall where her grandmother's initials were cut, feeling the cool, steady certainty of it, all that stone that had been here before her and would be here long after, holding its temperature against the violence of every season, and she understood something she had not quite been able to put into words until this moment. She was not waiting out the winter. She was learning to make use of it. The cold came in earnest the first week of November, not as a gradual descent, but as a decision the territory made overnight. Vesper woke to find the water in the tin cup she had left near the cabin door frozen solid, a small disk of gray ice that she cracked with her thumbnail and dropped outside. The ground beyond the cabin had gone from soft to iron hard, the soil contracting around every stone and root with a grip that would not loosen until April. She stood in the cabin doorway for a moment and felt the air on her face and noted what it told her, which was that everything she had built in the past 6 weeks was about to be tested in the only way that mattered. She went back inside and stoked the fire. The days that followed took on a shape she had not anticipated, not because they were harder than she expected, though some of them were, but because they were more precise. Survival at the margin of sufficiency is a discipline without tolerance for approximation. There was a correct amount of wood to cut each day, and cutting less meant shortfall, and cutting more meant burning energy she could not replace. There was a correct amount of water to draw from the seep, enough to water the cave garden and the animals and keep her canteen full without depleting the basin faster than the seep could replenish it. There was a correct ration of flour and beans per day that would stretch her supplies to a calculated date without dropping below the caloric threshold at which the work became impossible. She had done these calculations on a piece of bark with a charred stick, and she referred to them the way her grandmother's generation referred to scripture, as a fixed point in an uncertain world. The cave had become something she thought of as a second room rather than a natural feature. She had added to it steadily. A shelf cut into the wall above the seep basin for storing dried herbs she gathered in the last warm days, a second pen division that gave the sheep more room than the hens and kept the temperature distribution more even. The kale seedlings had emerged in the second week of October, pale and tentative, and by November they had darkened to a deep, serious green, Small plants still but living, growing by increments in the cool dimness of the cave. The carrots had germinated more slowly, and she could see only their ferny tops above the soil line, but they were there. She checked them each morning the same way she checked the animals, crouching close, touching the soil to feel the moisture level, adjusting the water accordingly. The hens had settled into the cave with a pragmatism she found admirable. They had identified the warmest corner of their pen, near the wall that backed onto the cabin fireplace, and roosted there every night in a tight cluster. Within 10 days of arriving, they had begun to lay. Not with the regularity they might have managed in a proper henhouse in milder country, but 1 egg per day between the 4 of them. Sometimes 2, which was more than she had counted on, and which altered her daily meal calculation in a favorable direction. A boiled egg with the morning porridge was a different proposition than porridge alone. It was the difference between fuel and nourishment. The sheep had required more from her than the hens. The ewe, whom she had not named because naming animals you might eventually need to eat, was a sentimentality she could not afford at these margins, was a calm animal, accustomed to being handled, who had accepted the cave quickly. The young ram was different. He was not aggressive, but he was restless, pacing his area of the pen with a repetitive circuit that wore a path in the cave floor and expressed itself as a low, periodic rumble she could hear from the cabin. She spent time with him in the evenings, speaking in a low, continuous voice without particular content, just sound, the kind of presence that tells an animal there is no threat nearby. By the end of October, he had stopped pacing. She had not spoken to a human being since leaving Harlan Flats with the animals. This fact registered in her consciousness without distress. In her father's house, she had spoken often and been heard seldom. Here the silence was at least honest. It was simply the absence of unnecessary noise, and she was finding, slowly, that she could think more clearly inside it than she ever had inside the ambient sound of a household that tolerated her presence without quite valuing it. She thought about the letters EMC, cut into the cave wall by a woman who had also been alone here, who had sat in this same cave and understood the same geometry of survival. She thought about what her grandmother had built in that winter of 1867, and how she had apparently built enough of it to last. She thought about the seeds Dorothea Morrow had given her, pressed into her pocket without explanation, and the precise intention behind an act that careful people do not do by accident. The second week of November brought the first real snowfall, not the dusting that had appeared twice already in October and melted within hours, but a genuine accumulation that settled overnight and covered the canyon floor in 8 inches of white by morning. She went outside at first light and stood in it and looked at the changed landscape. The ravine where she had harvested timber was a series of white shapes, the logged areas now marked by the absence of vertical shadows. The cliff face above her was unchanged by snow, too sheer for it to collect on, gray and impervious. The silence was of a different order than the silence of bare ground in autumn. No absorbed sound rather than simply not making it, and the canyon was hushed in a way that felt deliberate. She went back in, boiled water for her morning porridge, checked the cave, fed the animals. Then she sharpened her axe, because she had learned already that a dull axe on cold wood was a waste of everything, energy and time, and the wood itself, which shattered wrong under a blade that did not cut cleanly. She sharpened it with the smooth stone she had selected for this purpose from the ravine bed, working in long, even strokes that produced a sound like a question being asked repeatedly. The edge came back quickly. Good steel held an edge well, and this was good steel, the one thing Silas Morrow had not tried to talk her out of purchasing. She went out to cut wood. The cold at this altitude and in this season had a quality of compression to it, pressing in from all sides rather than simply surrounding. Her breath came out in plumes that the still air held for a moment before dispersing. The axe bit into the pine she had already felled, splitting the rounds cleanly along the grain, and the sound of it traveled up the canyon and came back faintly from the far wall. She worked for 2 hours, cut enough to replenish what she had burned the previous 2 days, stacked it under the overhang where the cliff would keep it from being buried in the next snowfall, and went back inside. In the cave that afternoon, she noticed the soil in the sheep pen was looser than it had been the day before, not dramatically, not in a way that would have announced itself if she had not been paying the level of attention that the narrowness of her margins required. A section of the pen floor, roughly 2 feet square in the far corner, showed disturbance the hooves could not account for, because the disturbance was too even, too contained, too much like the outline of something, rather than the random tracking of an animal moving through a space. She got down on her knees and pressed her palms flat against the disturbed area. The soil there gave slightly more than the surrounding floor, not with the soft give of loose fill, but with the resistance of something underneath that was not rock. She went and got the small spade she had fashioned from a piece of flat stone hafted to a pine branch, and she began to dig carefully, moving the soil an inch at a time. At a depth of 6 inches, her spade hit something hard that was not granite. The sound it made was not the ring of stone, but the duller, softer resistance of metal. She set the spade down and used her fingers, clearing the soil away in careful handfuls until the shape of the thing revealed itself. A container of some kind, rectangular, perhaps 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, wrapped in a piece of what had once been good leather but had dried and stiffened over years, into something that cracked at the edges when she lifted it. She brought it out into the lamplight and sat back on her heels and looked at it. The leather wrapping had been tied with a length of gut cord that was still intact, and she worked at the knot with her thumbnail until it released. Inside the leather was a tin box, its seams soldered shut, no markings on the exterior. The solder along the lid was old but unbroken. She went to the cabin and got her pocket knife and came back and worked the blade carefully along the solder line, not forcing it, finding the place where the metal had a slight irregularity that gave her purchase. The lid came free with a sound like a small exhalation. Inside the box, a cloth bag drawn tight at the neck with a twisted wire, and beneath it, folded twice, a piece of paper. Cloth bag she set aside, the paper she unfolded. The handwriting was her grandmother's. She recognized it from the deed, from the few letters Vesper Calloway had sent over the years, from the particular character of certain letters, the way the capital E had a slight backward lean, the way the lowercase g dropped lower than it needed to. The paper was dated in the upper right corner, October 1871. She read it in full before she reread any part of it. Her grandmother had been 26 years old in the winter of 1867 when she came to Hollow Rock for the first time, a widow 4 months after the death of her first husband, in an accident on the freighting route between Cheyenne and the territory to the north. She had come to the cave, not because she had chosen it, but because she had run out of other choices, which Vesper understood was sometimes how correct choices get made. She had lived in the cave for one winter, extended her stay through the spring, built what could be built with what she had, and left in the summer of 1868 with enough resources to begin again somewhere more hospitable. She had bought the land claim in 1869 because she understood what it was: not a homestead, not a farm, but a fortress, a place where someone with the right kind of patience could outlast almost anything the season could devise. She had held the claim for 12 years. She had never told anyone about the cave except Dorothea Morrow, who had been a young woman newly arrived in Harlan Flats in 1870, who had listened to the whole story and said very little and forgotten none of it. The letter was not addressed to Vesper by name. It was addressed to whoever you are. If you have found this, you have already done the difficult part. The rest of it was not sentiment. It was instruction, specific and practical: the cave's behavior across the seasons, where additional water sources appeared in spring melt, which areas of the canyon floor held soil deep enough for cultivation, what kind of wood burned hottest for the least volume, how to recognize the point at which the cave temperature would begin to rise in late winter as the thermal mass responded to the lengthening days. Near the end, her grandmother had written one line that was not instruction. The people who told you this was nothing were telling you what they were capable of seeing. That is a statement about them, not about the land. Vesper read this 3 times, not because it was unclear, but because it was the most direct address anyone had offered her in as long as she could remember. Then she set the letter carefully on the stone shelf above the seep, where the air was dry. She picked up the cloth bag and worked the wire fastening loose. The coins that poured into her palm were gold, 9 of them the double eagle denomination, $20 each. She counted them twice, then sat with them in her cupped hands and felt the weight of $180 in a way that required her to breathe for a moment before she could think about it clearly. It was not a fortune by the standards of the territory's larger transactions, but by the standards of a girl who had started with $17, it was the difference between a first winter and a first decade. She put the coins back in the bag back in the tin on the shelf beside the letter. Then she sat in the cave with the animals breathing around her and the seep marking its patient count and the kale standing green in the lamplight, and she felt something she had been too focused to feel since September, the specific quality of being right about something that everyone else had said was wrong. It was not pride exactly. It was something quieter than pride and more durable. She did not think about what she would do with the money that night. Right now there were beans to soak for tomorrow's breakfast and a crack in the north wall of the cabin. She had noticed that morning which needed another application of the clay mixture before the cold could enlarge it. The money would keep. The wall would not. December arrived like a verdict. The snow that came in the first week was not the polite accumulating variety of November, but a horizontal assault that turned the canyon into a corridor of driving white. She had watched the sky change in the 12 hours before it started, the color going from the pale winter blue she had grown familiar with to a heavy, yellowish gray that carried no shadows and made every distance uncertain. The animals had been restless the day before the storm, the ewe pacing the perimeter of her pen with short, agitated circuits that Vesper had learned to read as a kind of weather report. She had spent that day splitting additional wood, cutting enough for 4 days beyond her usual store, and stacking it against the inside of the cave entrance where it would stay dry, regardless of what the storm brought. She had also, on the day before the storm, coiled her longest rope near the cabin's center, post the structural element that ran from floor to ridgepole, the one she trusted most in the building. She had thought carefully about the problem of disorientation in whiteout conditions and concluded that the best defense against it was to prepare before the need arose. She would not go outside during the storm unless the situation demanded it. If it demanded it, she would fix one end of that rope to the post and carry the other with her as a lifeline. The storm hit in the early hours of the night, and the sound of it was different from anything she had heard in the canyon in the preceding months. The wind she had grown accustomed to had a voice she understood, a high, relatively steady pitch with variations she could predict. This was something else, a force that seemed to operate on multiple registers simultaneously, a low, structural thrumming in the rock itself, combined with a high roar at the canyon's upper edges where the wind was deflected over the cliff faces, and an irregular, concussive battering against the cabin wall that she felt through the logs as much as heard. The window, her single pane of salvaged glass, went white within 2 hours as the drifting snow covered it, and after that the cabin existed in a firelit dimness that gave it the quality of a room that had been this way for a long time. She went into the cave every few hours to check the animals. The ewe had gone still and calm, which animals under stress sometimes do when the noise of the world reaches a volume beyond their ability to process it. The ram stood in the center of his area with his head low. The hens were pressed together in their corner, motionless. The cave's sound isolation was remarkable. The structural roar of the storm outside reduced to that low, almost geological vibration, felt in the soles of the feet rather than heard with the ears. The thermal mass of the surrounding rock was doing precisely what she had understood it would do. She slept in the cabin in short intervals, waking every 2 or 3 hours to add wood to the fire, a precaution she maintained across the full duration of the storm, because a fire that goes out at 2 in the morning in a Wyoming blizzard is a qualitatively different problem than a fire that needs stoking at noon. On the second night of the storm, she was awake, feeding the fire at what she estimated was near midnight, when she heard something that was not the wind and not the structural voice of the rock and not an animal. Stopped moving. It came again from the direction of the cabin door. A rhythm in it, irregular but human, the difference between a branch beating against a wall, which has no intention, and a hand doing the same thing, which does. She sat for 3 seconds and listened and confirmed what it was. She took the iron poker from beside the fireplace. Then she thought more clearly and put it back, because a person capable of crossing Hollow Rock Canyon in that storm in the middle of the night was not a predator in any ordinary sense. They were someone in serious trouble. She lifted the heavy bar from the door brackets, eased the door open against the pressure of the drifted snow that had built against the exterior, and opened it wide enough to see. The figure that came through the gap fell rather than stepped, a controlled collapse that she had to step aside from, and it hit the cabin floor with the particular dead weight of a body that has spent its last available energy arriving somewhere. She got the door closed against the wind, which took both hands and her full weight against the wood, got the bar down, and turned around. Cutter Hayes lay on the floor of her cabin. He was wearing everything he owned. By the look of it, 3 coats layered over each other, trousers tucked into boots packed with snow, a scarf wound multiple times over his face and ears, leaving only his eyes exposed. Those eyes were open and blinking, which was the first positive sign. His color was bad, a grayish quality to the visible skin around his eyes, and his breath when it came was shallow and rapid rather than the deep, hard breathing of someone who has been physically exerting themselves. He had been cold, very cold, long enough to have passed the shivering stage, which was not a good sign. She got the outer 2 coats off him, which he could not help with, and she dragged him by the armpits the 6 feet to the fireside and got him positioned with his feet toward the fire at a distance that would warm him without burning, which is a detail people who have not dealt with cold injuries sometimes get wrong. She covered him with both her blankets, went to the fire and built it higher, put water on to boil. His voice, when it came, was thick and slow, the consonants imprecise in a way that was not drunkenness but cold, interfering with the fine motor control of the jaw. Wagon. A pause during which he seemed to gather the words from some distance. Morrow's wagon. South Run. Another pause came over on the creek bank. Couldn't hold the horses. His eyes found her face with some difficulty. Silas and the missus, he stopped. She felt the meaning of this before she processed the words, a cold certainty somewhere below her sternum that had nothing to do with temperature. The Morrows had been on the road south before the storm came in, which meant they had been caught on the creek road when it hit, which meant they were somewhere out in the canyon in a turned wagon with no shelter and 2 nights of this storm behind them. She got a cup of hot water into Cutter and confirmed that his color was returning and his breathing had deepened. He had reached the cabin on his own legs, which meant his feet were functioning. She checked his fingers and confirmed they had sensation. He would be stiff for several days, but he would be whole. Which direction? She was already moving toward her coat. South run past the first bend. His head moved on the floor, trying to track her. You can't go out there. She was pulling on her coat over the one she already wore. How far from the bend? Maybe 200 yards south of it. His voice was gaining edges now, the cold loosening its hold on his diction as the fire worked. There's a drop on the creek bank. They'd have gone over on the east side. He watched her take the long rope from where she had coiled it near the post. What are you doing with that? She tied one end of the rope around the central cabin post, the structural element she trusted most in the building. She fed the rope out in her hands, estimating the length. 100 feet. She would know if it was enough when she got as far as it reached. The horses, she said. Gone. His voice was flat, with the finality of something he had already grieved. Ran when we went over. I tried to follow them in the first hour. She wound the rope into a coil she could manage with one arm and looked at the door. Outside, the storm had not diminished. She could hear it clearly from inside the cabin, the sound of the world operating at a scale that did not accommodate human preference. She opened the door. The cold was of a different quality than even the cold she had been living in. It was not air in any way she would usually use the word. It was a medium, dense, and aggressive that pressed against her face and drove into the gap at her collar and immediately began persuading her body to redirect its resources. She tucked her chin, pulled the scarf up over everything below her eyes, and stepped out. The snow was past her knees in the open area in front of the cabin, deeper in the places where the canyon walls created eddies in the wind. She moved with deliberate steps, testing each one before committing her weight, because the ground beneath the snow was uneven and the drifts concealed the difference between solid footing and the edge of a drop. She kept the cliff face to her left, using it as her north bearing, letting the rope uncoil steadily from her arm. When the wind drove the snow horizontally, it blinded her completely for intervals of 3 or 4 seconds at a time, and she stopped during these, waiting with her eyes closed and her shoulder against the rock until the gust passed and the world reformed in front of her. The rope played out more quickly than she expected. 50 feet, 70. She was past the point where she could see the cabin. 80 feet, 90. At 93 feet by her count, the rope pulled taut against the post in the cabin. She stood in the middle of the storm and understood clearly that the choice was to go back for more rope, which would cost time she did not have, or to tie the rope off at something fixed in the terrain and go forward without it. There was a boulder at the edge of the canyon wall to her left, a granite mass she knew from having seen it daily for 2 months, visible now as a white shape with dark edges. She moved to it and tied the rope end around it with 2 half hitches pulled tight, giving herself a fixed anchor point she could return to. Then she went forward without the rope. She counted her steps. At 110 steps from the boulder, she hit the slope of the creek bank, which she felt rather than saw, her lead foot finding the downward angle and her body adjusting automatically. She moved along the bank rather than down it, feeling the edge, and at approximately 40 steps along the bank, she found what she was looking for. The wagon had gone over on the east side, as Cutter had said, and it lay on its side in the creek bed, which was frozen solid and had prevented a worse impact. The canvas top had partially collapsed and was filled with snow, and under its lee, wedged between the overturned wagon box and the frozen creek bank, were Silas and Dorothea Morrow. Silas was conscious. He looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the careful assessment he brought to everything in his store. Not the measured neutrality of a man who had learned to keep his judgments internal. What she saw was the unguarded look of someone who has spent a significant portion of the night genuinely uncertain whether they will see another morning. He was holding his wife close against him with both arms, and Dorothea's eyes were closed. Vesper crouched and put her hand to Dorothea's face. Warm. She was breathing. How long? She looked at Silas over his wife's shoulder. We came over before dark yesterday. His voice had the same quality Cutter's had when he first arrived, the consonants losing their precision. Maybe 3 hours before dark. She had been out in the elements for the better part of 2 full nights. Vesper made a rapid assessment. Dorothea was breathing, warm from her husband's body heat, but she was not shivering, which was concerning in the same way Cutter's stillness had been concerning. She needed warmth before the next few hours produced a deterioration that would be difficult to reverse. Can you walk? Silas shifted his weight, tested his legs, and pushed himself to a standing position against the wagon side. His movement was stiff and slow, but it was movement. I can walk. Your wife will need help. I know it. He bent and gathered Dorothea against him with the particular care of a man who has been holding something precious for a very long time and has no intention of dropping it. The return was the most difficult navigation she had undertaken in 2 months of difficult navigation. She had her own footprints to follow for the first 40 steps from the wagon, but the wind erased them efficiently, and beyond that she was working from feel. From the angle of the terrain, from the direction the snow drove against her face. She reached the canyon wall by moving upslope until she hit rock, then moved north along it, counting steps, looking for the boulder where the rope was tied. Silas followed with Dorothea, and twice she stopped and waited for him to close the distance because she did not intend to arrive at the anchor point without both of them behind her. She found the boulder. She found the rope. The return along the rope was a different journey entirely. The rope told her exactly where she was in relation to where she was going, and she moved along it hand over hand while Silas followed with his wife. And the cabin appeared in the blown snow first as a darkness and then as a shape, and then as the specific shape of something she had built herself, post by post and log by log, and she got the door open. The heat from the cabin fell on them like a physical weight. Cutter Hayes had gotten himself to a sitting position against the wall nearest the fire, and he watched with wide eyes as Silas came through the door with Dorothea, and something moved across his face that was more than relief and less than comprehension. He moved aside without being asked, making room near the fire. Vesper directed Silas to set his wife down on the near side of the fire, at the correct distance, and covered her with the better of the two blankets. She built the fire higher and put water on to heat, and she moved between the three of them with the focused efficiency of someone whose entire skill set had been built for exactly this kind of problem. She checked Dorothea again and found her color returning, a faint pink replacing the gray, and within 20 minutes the older woman's eyes had opened and were tracking the room with the uncertain attention of someone waking from a deep and unexpected sleep. Silas sat beside his wife and held her hand and watched Vesper move around the cabin, and he did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was not to express the gratitude that was written clearly on his face. It was in the manner of a man whose first language is assessment, rather than sentiment, a question that was also a statement. You went back out for them. He was looking at the rope still looped around the cabin post. In that, she was ladling hot water into the tin cups. There are 4 cups of water here. You will drink them slowly. She carried the cups to the 3 of them, sat on the floor near the cave entrance, and drank her own, and the storm continued outside with the same impersonal intensity it had maintained since it began. Not caring about any of this, not caring about the 4 people around the fire, or the rope tied to the boulder, or the sheep breathing quietly in the cave, or the kale growing green in the lamplight 30 feet from where they sat. Storm was simply the storm. It did not need to be survived by anyone in particular. It only needed to be survived. In the morning, when the wind had dropped from a roar to something she could distinguish from silence, Dorothea Morrow asked if she could see the inside of the cave. She asked it in the way a person asks to see something they have heard about for a long time, not with the curiosity of the uninformed, but with the particular attention of someone confirming something they already more or less know. Vesper led her through the cabin and into the cave and held the lamp up. Dorothea moved through the space without speaking, stopping at the sheep pen, looking at the hens, bending to examine the kale and carrot beds with a care that was not casual. She stood at the back of the cave and listened to the water for a moment, and then she moved the lamp to the wall beside the seep and looked at the 3 letters cut into the stone. Stood there for a long time. She told me about this place. Her voice was quiet, shaped for this space rather than the world outside it. Everything she told me was true. She touched the initials with one finger, tracing the cuts. She said it would need the right person to come to it. Someone who would understand what it was before they'd built anything, just from standing in it. She lowered her hand. That was why I gave you the seeds. Not because I was certain, because you asked the right question. Vesper did not ask what question she meant. She remembered standing at Silas Morrow's counter, looking at the land deed, and saying nothing about its value in money. She had asked, as her grandmother had perhaps asked 30 years before, about what the land could grow. It was a small distinction. It was everything. The storm broke fully on the morning of the 3rd day, leaving the world outside the cabin completely transformed, the canyon floor a smooth white surface that hid every feature she knew by heart. The sky above the cliff was hard blue, the kind of sky that follows a major storm as if the atmosphere is establishing new terms. Cutter Hayes appeared beside her in the doorway. He looked out at the transformed canyon for a while without speaking. She let the silence extend because it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that contains something being decided. I owe you an accounting, he said finally. Not an apology exactly, because a man like Cutter Hayes would not arrive at an apology from the direction of humility. He would come to it from the direction of accuracy. What I said in Silas's store about the cave. He stopped. I was saying what I could see. I couldn't see this. She turned to look at him. The color had fully returned to his face and he was standing straight, his coat back on, his jaw working its familiar rhythm. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had learned that looking away cost more than the discomfort of looking. She turned back to the canyon. There's a cord of wood needs splitting before the next snow, and the south face of the sheep pen needs a second layer of chinking. A pause. Then he moved to where the axe was hanging and took it down. By the time the Morrows were ready to leave, which was the morning of the following day, the storm's meaning had been silently renegotiated among all 4 of them. Dorothea walked through the cabin once more before she left, pausing at the cave entrance and then moving on without going in again, as if she had seen what she came to see and committed it fully to memory. Silas stood with his hat in his hands at the cabin door, which was a gesture Vesper had not seen from him before, a suspension of the careful management of appearance that was his usual mode. "We told you it was nothing." He said it plainly, the way he stated any fact that had proven itself. "My wife told me later what she knew, what Elspeth had told her." He turned the hat's brim through his fingers. "I should have listened more carefully." Vesper looked at him. "You packed the flour in 9 double sacks," she said. That mattered. It stayed dry. It was the truth that fit the moment. The rest of the accounting between them could wait for the season to change, and it would change, as seasons always did, regardless of whether anything that needed to be said between people had been said. The important things would find their time. She stood in the doorway of her cabin and watched the three of them make their way up the canyon. Silas and Dorothea side by side, Cutter a few paces behind, all of them moving through the deep snow with the careful deliberation of people who had been reminded recently that the territory between shelter and exposure is narrower than it usually appears. She watched them until the canyon bend took them out of sight. Then she went back inside. The cave was exactly as she had left it. The sheep were awake but calm, the ewe moving to the fence line to look at her as she came through, the way the ewe did every morning, the same unhurried assessment. The hens had resumed their routine as if the storm had been a minor interruption in a schedule that took precedence over weather. She went to the shelf above the seep and took down the tin box. She opened it and looked at the coins for a moment without touching them, feeling the weight of the winter that separated her from the September morning when she had stood on her father's porch with $17 and a folded deed and a door clicking shut behind her. Then she put the lid back on the box and returned it to the shelf. There was a crack in the east wall of the cave that she had noticed 2 days before the storm, thin as a knife's edge but present, running from floor to shoulder height in the granite. It needed to be addressed before the next freeze cycle widened it. She picked up the clay vessel and the mixing stick and went to look at it more closely, pressing the tip of her finger into the crack's width, feeling how far in it went. The winter was not finished with her yet. But then, she was not finished with it either. January came in without announcement, the way the deepest part of winter always does, not as an arrival but as a revelation that it had been here all along, and simply waiting for the calendar to acknowledge it. The crack in the east wall of the cave took 3 applications of clay mixture over 5 days to seal properly, the first 2 shrinking too fast in the cold and reopening along the same line, the third holding only after she added a finer grade of sand to the mixture and pressed it in layers rather than all at once. The repair held. She ran her fingertip along the sealed line each morning for a week afterward, confirming what she already knew but wanted to keep knowing. The canyon in January was a different country than it had been in November. The snows had settled and compressed under its own weight until it was dense enough to walk on without breaking through past the ankle, which changed the nature of the daily wood-cutting trip from a slog through loose powder to something more like walking on firm ground, if the ground happened to be white and gave under pressure by a 1/4 inch with every step. She had made a pair of rough snowshoes from bent pine branches lashed with rawhide strips cut from scrap hide she had accumulated, wearing them on the days when fresh snow had fallen and the surface had not yet compressed. The ewe had been putting on weight in a way that was either the natural cycle of an animal wintering well or something else. Vesper had noticed it first in the 3rd week of December, the slight thickening through the middle, that was not the same as the rounding that came from adequate feed. She crouched in the pen one morning in early January and ran her hands along the ewe's sides, pressing gently, and felt the unmistakable firmness of a pregnancy that had already progressed well past its first stages. The ram had arrived at Hollow Rock as a young but sexually mature animal. The arithmetic was plain. By Vesper's estimate, the ewe would lamb sometime in March, which was still deep winter in Carbon County, but was also the time when a lamb born into a warm cave would have the best chance of making it through to the grass. She adjusted the feed calculation immediately. A pregnant ewe needed more than maintenance rations, and her dried grass stores were finite, but the cave garden had been producing steadily, and the outer leaves of the kale could be harvested without killing the plant. She began supplementing the ewe's ration with harvested kale leaves and carrot tops, which the animal accepted with the focused attention of a creature that understood at some level what it needed. The carrot beds were ready to begin a partial harvest by the 2nd week of January. The carrots themselves were small, thinner than she had hoped, the result of a first planting in suboptimal soil at a difficult time of year, but they were carrots in the full sense of the word, orange and firm in tasting. When she bit into the first one, exactly as a carrot should taste. She sat on the cave floor with the carrot in her hand and the lamp burning on the shelf and thought that the word good was doing different work in that sentence than it would have done in September. Good now meant alive and producing in a place where no one had expected anything to grow, which was a different kind of good, a harder one kind, and she preferred it. Her flour stores were lower than she had projected, the extra mows of 3 days with the Morrows and Cutter Hayes having drawn down the reserves faster than she had accounted for. The beans were adequate but not generous. What she had now that she had not had in October was the garden, producing at modest but real levels, and the hens, laying with the dependable modesty of animals that have settled into their routine. The food situation was not comfortable, but it was a problem she could do arithmetic on, which meant it was a problem she could manage. The coins had not moved from the tin on the shelf. She was not ready to spend them yet because spending them meant making decisions about what came after this winter, and what came after this winter was a question that did not yet have enough information behind it to answer well. She would know more in spring. She would know what the land looked like when the snow was off it, what the soil in the ravine bottom was actually capable of, whether the seep's output changed with the season. She needed to see the land through a full year before she could build a plan for it that was worth the money it would cost. January deepened. February arrived with less ceremony than the months before it, which Vesper took as a positive sign, because the months with the most dramatic arrivals in Wyoming were generally the worst ones. The cold was constant, and the snow came in regular intervals that she had begun to anticipate by the changes in the sky color and the behavior of the animals. The ewe was her most reliable forecaster. When the ewe stood at the fence line looking toward the cave entrance for more than a few minutes, weather was coming within 24 hours. This pattern held accurately through 6 storms in January and February without exception. She had begun in the deep quiet of the winter evenings to write things down. She had no paper, but the inner surfaces of pine bark could be written on with a charred stick if the bark was dry and the writing was done in a deliberate hand. She made a series of bark sheets, each roughly the size of a woman's hand, and on them she recorded what she was learning: the temperature differential between cave and outside air at various dates, the seep output in measured cups per hour, the growth rate of the kale and carrots under different watering regimens, the behavioral signs that preceded weather changes, the correct angle for the axe stroke on frozen versus thawed wood. It was not the kind of record that would mean anything to someone who had not stood in this specific cave in this specific winter, but it would mean something to someone who had, or who intended to. She stacked the bark sheets on the shelf beside the tin box, weighted down with a smooth stone. The last week of February brought a change she had been watching for, without knowing exactly what form it would take. The quality of the light at the cave entrance shifted, spending more hours in the day at the angle that sent a long, direct beam into the front chamber. The days were growing longer, and while the change was imperceptible from one day to the next, the accumulation over weeks was visible in the reach of the afternoon light across the cave floor. It extended further toward the back of the chamber than it had in December. The kale responded immediately, the plants that received the longer light putting on new growth at a pace she could measure daily. The carrots responded more slowly, but the carrot tops were thicker and darker by the 1st of March. The cave temperature had risen. Not dramatically, not to the point of warmth in any comfortable sense, but to the point where her breath no longer clouded as visibly in the deeper sections of the chamber. The thermal mass was absorbing the season's shift through the rock itself, as her grandmother's letter had promised it would. She was not waiting out the winter anymore. The winter was ending, on its own terms and at its own pace, and she was inside the fact of it, rather than merely surviving the outside of it. The lamb came on the 12th of March. She had been watching the ewe for 2 days, the animal's behavior shifting in ways that were specific and unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. A different quality of movement, purposeful and circular, the ewe rearranging the dried grass in her pen corner with her nose. Vesper moved the ram to the opposite side of the pen divider and spent the night in the cave, sleeping in intervals against the cave wall, waking to check every 2 hours. The birth was fast and uncomplicated. The lamb arrived in the early hours before dawn, while the lamp burned low on the shelf. It was a female, small and complete, with the dark, wet wool of a newborn that the ewe was already attending to, before Vesper had fully registered that it was there. She crouched at the pen fence and watched the ewe work, and felt a quality of attention that was different from any she had brought to the cave before. Something had been produced here. Not found, not preserved, but generated, one life becoming 2 in the specific place where she had chosen to be. The lamb was on its feet within the hour, unsteady but insistent, finding what it needed with the certainty of something that does not yet know how to be uncertain. Vesper went back to the cabin at first light, built the fire, boiled water, and sat with her hands around the tin cup for a long time without drinking. March brought the first real thaw, not a full warming but a softening, 3 consecutive days above freezing that took the top layer of snow to slush and sent a thin brown runoff down the canyon floor. She went out on the 3rd day and walked the ravine, looking at the land she had been unable to fully assess since October. The soil in the ravine bottom was dark, where the snow had retreated from it, the color of soil that had organic material in it from years of leaf fall and creek deposit. She crouched and pressed her fingers into it. 6 inches of workable depth before she hit the clay layer, in some places more. The entire ravine bottom was potential planting ground. She walked south past the point where the creek bank dropped, past the place where the Morrow's wagon had gone over. The creek itself was running now, freed from the ice, a thin, steady flow over the flat stones of the bed. She stood and looked at it and thought about water, about moving water versus static water, about what could be done with a consistent water source at a lower elevation than the cave. She was not ready to think about it practically yet, but she let the thought form and sit. She was on her way back to the cabin, the sun already dropping toward the canyon rim, when she heard footsteps on the compacted snow of the canyon approach, distinct and deliberate, the sound of someone who knew they were heading somewhere specific and was not trying to be quiet about it. Edwin Calloway came around the canyon's southern bend into sight. He was alone on foot, wearing the good coat he kept for occasions he considered worth the coat, which was a narrower category than most people's. He was carrying nothing except a small leather satchel she did not recognize. He looked older than September, which was not surprising because he had been older since September, as all of them had. He stopped when he saw her, and they regarded each other across the canyon floor with the particular attention of people who share a history they have not finished accounting for. She did not move toward him. She waited, because waiting was what the situation called for, and she had learned over the winter that most things revealed their nature more quickly when she was still than when she moved to meet them. He came the rest of the way across the canyon floor and stopped 6 feet from her, which was the distance her father maintained when he was not sure of his welcome. He looked at the cabin first, then at the cliff face above it, then at her. He was doing the assessment she recognized, the calibration of what he was seeing against what he had expected, and she could see in the set of his expression that the calibration was requiring more adjustment than he had allocated for. "I heard what happened," he said. "In December. Harlan Flats is a small town." He nodded once, the distinction between accepting a fact and having anything useful to add to it. He looked at the cabin again. "You built this." "I built it." He was quiet for a moment, turning the satchel handle in his hands, a movement she remembered from her childhood as the thing he did when he was working toward something he had not yet found the words for. He opened the satchel and brought out a pocket knife she had not seen in years. The bone handle was worn smooth in the way handles wear when they pass through the same hands daily for decades. It had belonged to her grandfather, her mother's father, a man who had come to Wyoming territory in 1866 with a mule and a handsaw and built 3 structures that were still standing. He held it out toward her. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it, and then at him. That was his. It was. He turned it once in his fingers. "He gave it to me when I married your mother. He said a man ought to have a good knife." He stopped, looking at the knife rather than at her. He also said the knife ought to go to whoever in the family was going to need it most. He turned it toward her again, handle first. "I don't think that's me anymore." She took it. The bone handle was exactly as warm as his hand had made it, and the weight of it was familiar in the way things are familiar when you have seen them used all your life without ever holding them yourself. He stayed for perhaps an hour. She showed him the cabin, the fireplace, the cave. He did not speak much in the cave, moving through it with the quiet of a man in a space he has underestimated in a way he cannot quickly measure. He stopped at the kale beds for a long time. He looked at the lamb without comment, but he crouched to examine the ewe, running a practiced hand along her back. She came through well. He stood up. Better than I'd have expected for a first lambing in a cave in Carbon County in March. She had good conditions. Something shifted in his expression at this. He had heard what she meant, which was not that the cave was warm or that the feed had been adequate, but that the conditions she had built were the conditions that made it possible, and that this was not a matter of luck but of understanding followed by work. He accepted this without arguing with it. For a man of his particular formation, acceptance without argument was the closest available expression of respect. Before he left, standing at the canyon entrance as the afternoon light went gold on the cliff face above the cabin, he said one more thing. "Thomas asks after you." Her younger brother, the pale face at the window in September. He wanted to come. I told him to wait until the snow was off the road. She thought about Thomas, who was 12 and curious and had always watched things more carefully than he spoke about them. "He can come when the road is clear." Her father nodded and left. She stood in the canyon entrance and watched him go until the bend took him out of sight, then looked down at the knife in her hand. She turned it once the way he had turned it, feeling the smoothness of the handle. Then she went back inside. Word spread from Harlan Flats the way significant things spread in small territory towns, not through gossip, which moves quickly but dies at the edge of what people find entertaining, but through the slower, more durable channel of account, the story of something true told by people who had witnessed it and staked their own credibility on the telling. Silas Morrow told the story of December the way he told any transaction, factually, with specific detail, without embellishment. Dorothea told it differently, with attention to what she had seen in the cave, the kale beds, the spring, the initials cut in the wall. Cutter Hayes said less than either of them, but what he said carried a particular weight because everyone in Harlan Flats knew that Cutter Hayes did not revise his assessments, and the fact that his assessment of Vesper Calloway had been revised completely was itself a kind of testimony. The first visitor came in the third week of March. A neighboring homesteader named Albright, whose claim was 4 miles north of Harlan Flats, appeared at the canyon entrance one morning with a sack over his shoulder and the expression of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at a decision he intends to follow through on. He had seed potatoes in the sack, 2 varieties, an early and a late, more than he needed for his own planting. Silas Morrow says you know something about cold soil. He was looking at the cliff face above the cabin with the evaluating eye of a man who had spent his adult life reading terrain. My bottom field floods in the spring melt every year. Kills whatever I plant there before June. She understood. He was asking not for charity but for information, which meant he was offering something in return that had the same value he was asking to receive. She told him what she had learned about drainage and soil temperature and the behavior of planting beds that were shaded part of the day by a south-facing overhang. She told him about the interaction between soil depth and root crop timing. He listened with the focused quiet of a man who has tried things that did not work and is looking for the variable he missed. When she finished, he picked up his sack and set one variety of the seed potatoes on the cabin step. For the information, he said, and left. The blacksmith arrived 2 days later with a set of door hinges, proper iron ones, to replace the leather strap hinges she had been using, which had stretched over the winter and no longer allowed the door to close flush. He refitted the hinges himself, examining the door frame with the professional attention of a man whose work depends on other people's work being done correctly. She let him do it because it would have been a refusal of the right kind of offering to decline. A widow named Mrs. Fenwick came from the south side of town with 2 jars of pickled vegetables and asked, directly and without preamble, whether Vesper would sell her eggs on a regular basis. She named a price that was fair and consistent with what eggs cost at Morrow's in the summer months. Vesper said she would supply 6 eggs per week at that price. Mrs. Fenwick produced the coins from her coat pocket immediately, as if she had expected agreement and come prepared for it, and Vesper understood that she had been right to expect it, because a fair offer made in good faith to someone operating at a margin warranted a direct response. By the 1st of April, the arrangement had extended itself without any particular orchestration on her part. 4 households were purchasing eggs weekly. Albright had returned with a second sack, this one containing oats he had threshed in the fall and kept back from the mill, and he had walked the ravine with her and asked questions that told her he was thinking about what she had told him in a practical rather than theoretical way. 2 men had come to look at the cabin construction, which she showed them without false modesty, explaining the log lifting method and the flue adjustment and the chinking mixture, because knowledge of this kind had no diminishing value when shared. You lost nothing by giving it away and sometimes gained considerably. It was Dorothea Morrow who finally said what was accumulating in the behavior of everyone else. She arrived on a clear April morning with a basket of supplies. Not as charity, she was careful to make this plain, but as the practical contribution of someone who intended to be a regular visitor. She sat at the cabin table Vesper had built from split logs and looked around the space with the composed attention she brought to everything. People are going to keep coming here, Dorothea said. Not because they feel they owe you something, though some of them do. Because you know things they need to know. Vesper waited. Elspeth was the same. Dorothea set her basket on the table and began unpacking it. She didn't teach people. She just answered the questions they brought her, and they kept bringing more questions. She looked up. You might think about what you want from that. What it costs you, and what it gives you, and whether the balance suits. It was the most direct piece of advice anyone had offered her since September, and it was offered without any expectation of a particular answer, which was what made it worth considering. She had been considering it in the background of everything else, when the sound of hoofbeats on the canyon approach announced a visitor who came differently than the others. Faster, with less of the considered pace of someone who had thought over their arrival. She went to the door. Cutter Hayes dropped off his horse with the efficiency of a man for whom horses are practical equipment rather than companions. He had a leather roll under one arm, and he was moving with a forward momentum she associated with news rather than conversation. You need to know something. He came inside without being asked, which was the first time since December that he had done so, and she understood from this that what he had to say warranted the directness. He unrolled the leather on the table. Inside it was a document, a surveyor's map of the kind produced by the Land Office, Carbon County, dated 1879. He spread it flat and pointed to a section of the map in the northwest quarter of the territory it covered. Land Office has had a claim filed on the adjacent section, Section 23, filed 6 weeks ago by a company out of Denver. He looked at her. They're calling it a mineral claim. Speculative. But Section 23 shares the eastern wall of your canyon. She looked at the map. Section 23 ran along the northern edge of the canyon, sharing the cliff wall above the cave entrance for perhaps 300 yards of its length. What are they looking for, silver? Most likely. Or copper. There have been assay reports coming out of the mountains northwest of here that have Denver money moving. They're staking anything that shows a formation. He tapped the map. Your cliff face shows the right kind of geological pattern to look like promising ground if you're standing in Denver and looking at a survey. She looked at the canyon wall as she understood it from the inside. The granite formation, the fissures, the seep. The seep was the thing. The seep existed because water was moving through the rock along some pathway from above, and that pathway indicated fracturing patterns that a person interested in mineral deposits might read as interesting. She had read it as a water source. Someone else would read it differently. What do I need to do? Cutter put his finger on Section 14. Your claim is registered. That's not the problem. The problem is if they start working Section 23 and disturb the rock formation along the shared wall, it could change the drainage pattern that feeds your spring. He said it plainly, the way he said things that were true regardless of whether they were welcome. That seep goes dry, your cave loses its primary water source. She stood with this for a moment. Not with the fear of it, because fear was not a useful tool here, but with the structure of it, the way a problem had to be understood in its geometry before it could be addressed. I need to talk to the land office. I figured you'd say that. He rolled the map back up. I'll take you in tomorrow if you want. Silas knows the county clerk. He'll open doors faster than walking in cold. She looked at him. In December, he had told her she couldn't go out in the blizzard. He had been wrong about that, and he knew it, and the form his knowing it had taken was this reliable information delivered without delay, transportation offered without being asked for, connections made available without ceremony. I'll be ready at first light. He left the map with her. She spent the evening with it unrolled on the table, studying the survey lines and what she understood of the geology they described, the relationship between the formations on her claim and those on the adjacent section, the way water moved through rock of this composition at this altitude. Her grandmother's letter had described the spring's behavior across 2 seasons. She had her bark record of its output across this winter. Together they represented something the Denver company's surveyors would not have, which was specific, observed data about what the formation actually did rather than what survey marks suggested it might do. Knowledge had no diminishing value when shared, but it had considerable value when withheld at the right moment. She was at the land office in Harlan Flats by mid-morning the following day, Cutter having been as good as his word about the hour, and Silas Morrow having been as good as his word about the county clerk, a lean, precise man named Hartwell who knew his own records better than most people knew their own names. She set out what she knew on the desk in front of him, the claim document, her bark records of the seep output, her grandmother's letter describing the spring's behavior across seasons, and the surveyor's map with the adjacent claim marked. Hartwell studied each item in turn with the concentrated patience of a man for whom documents were not bureaucratic objects but stories. When he got to the bark records, he paused and read them more carefully, not once, but twice. You kept records all winter. I kept what I was learning. He set the bark sheets down and looked at her for a moment. There is a provision in the territorial code for claims that share a natural water feature. Spring that feeds your seep can be demonstrated to originate within or flow primarily through your claim boundary. Then any adjacent mineral operation has a legal obligation not to disturb the formation in ways that would affect your water access. He folded his hands on the desk. Can you demonstrate that? She thought about the letter, about the survey of the cave she had made in her first days there, about the direction from which the seep emerged, and what that implied about the water table. I can demonstrate that the water has been accessing this formation through Section 14 for at least 16 years, by documented record. I can demonstrate the output volume and seasonal pattern. A proper geological survey would establish the source pathway. Hartwell was already writing. I'll want copies of those records. And the letter. He looked up. The letter is particularly valuable because it predates the adjacent claim by 12 years. Prior use is a strong position. She left copies of everything with Hartwell and walked out of the land office into the April sunlight of Harlan Flats with Cutter Hayes beside her and the original bark sheets and her grandmother's letter in the satchel her father had brought to the canyon. The town looked different than it had in September. Not the buildings, which were the same structures they had always been. The difference was in how it read to her now, as a place that had some ongoing relationship with where she lived and what she was doing, rather than simply the nearest place to buy supplies. People on the street acknowledged her in the way they acknowledge members of a community, with brief nods and maintained eye contact, the minimal grammar of belonging. The woman who had watched from Morrow's store and looked away in October looked directly at her now and offered a word about the weather. Silas Morrow was waiting on the boardwalk outside the store. He had not gone into the land office with them because he understood correctly that what happened in there was Vesper's business to conduct, but he had been available in the way that useful people are available, near enough to help and far enough away not to interfere. Hartwell is a good man, he said. He'll do what the law requires. The question is whether the Denver company has the money to fight it. Do they? They might. He said it without softening. Companies like that don't stake marginal claims to leave them marginal. They either find what they're looking for and move fast, or they sell the claim to someone else who will. He watched a wagon moving down the main street. You should make it expensive for them to proceed, not impossible, necessarily expensive. The legal provision Hartwell had found was exactly that, the beginning of expensive. A claim that triggered a water rights assessment and a geological survey requirement would cost the Denver company months and money before they could break ground. Many such companies, confronted with that kind of delay on a speculative stake, simply moved their capital to less complicated ground. She would not know which kind of company this was for some time, but companies that move fast on easy ground rarely had the patience for a protracted legal contest over a seep in a granite canyon when other formations were waiting to be staked. She had given them a reason to move on. Whether they took it was their calculation to make. She accepted this. Long timelines were something she had developed a tolerance for over a winter of watching kale grow in lamplight. She was walking back toward the canyon that afternoon, with Cutter riding alongside her when Thomas appeared on the road from the north. He was on foot, which meant he had walked the 4 miles from the homestead, and he had a sack over his shoulder that was clearly heavier than he had planned for. He was 12 and tall for it, and had the look of a person who had decided to do something and was only now discovering the full cost. She stopped. He stopped. He looked at her with the particular expression of a boy who has prepared several things to say and is now unsure which is first. I wanted to come sooner, he said. Father said to wait. He was right. The road was bad until 10 days ago. Thomas looked at the sack on his shoulder. I brought things. I wasn't sure what you needed. I brought what seemed like it might matter. He shifted the sack, which clinked. Some nails. A jar of honey Mrs. Hutchins sent. And Father put in a letter. He didn't tell me what it said. He held the sack out toward her. She took it. The nails alone were worth more than he knew they were. Good iron nails being the kind of supply she had been working around all winter with wooden pegs and rawhide lashing. She handed the sack to Cutter to carry and looked at her brother, who had grown since September in the way boys his age grow. Not only upward but into their own faces. Do you want to see it, she said. His whole face changed, yes. They walked the last miles to the canyon together, and she answered his questions without simplifying them, because he was old enough to understand the real answers, and she had no interest in telling him a smaller version of what she had done. When they came through the canyon bend, and the cabin came into view against the cliff face, Thomas stopped walking. He stood and looked at it with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself. The specific quality of seeing something that contradicts what you expected to see and having to reorganize your understanding of what is possible. She showed him everything. The cabin, the fireplace she had rebuilt once before she got right, the cave, the garden beds, the spring. He crouched beside the kale beds and touched the leaves with careful attention, as if he were confirming something. He asked about the water, how much it produced and how consistent it was, and whether it changed with the season, and his questions told her that he had been thinking about this before he came, that the months of absence had not been absence of interest, but the particular sustained wondering of someone who does not yet have enough information to stop wondering. He found the tin box on the shelf while she was feeding the animals. She heard him stop moving and came back into the cave to find him holding it carefully, not having opened it, simply registering its presence. He set it back exactly where it had been. Is that from her? Yes. He nodded, which meant he had already understood more about his grandmother than most people bothered to understand about anyone, and he was confirming rather than discovering. She thought about what Dorothea had said, that Elspeth had simply answered the questions people brought her, and that people kept bringing more. She looked at Thomas and thought that some of what she had spent the winter learning was not only for herself and never had been. Her father's letter was at the bottom of the sack, folded once in the way he folded everything, crisp and precise. She opened it that evening after Thomas had gone to sleep on the spare blanket by the fire. The letter was short, 7 sentences, which was longer than her father usually wrote because he usually did not write at all. He said the wheat had come in better than expected in the fall, which meant the winter had been easier. He said Thomas spoke of her daily. He said the knife had belonged to a woman, first her grandmother's mother, who had carried it from Pennsylvania to Wyoming in 1862 and given it to Elspeth the year she married, and that he had perhaps held it too long past the time it should have moved on. The last sentence said only that a woman who built what she had built with what she had to build it with was not a woman he knew how to worry about, and he had stopped trying. She read it twice, then folded it along its original creases and put it in the tin box with the coins and her grandmother's letter where it seemed to belong. April moved toward May in the way that spring comes to high Wyoming, not all at once but in the incremental way that things in this country did everything, inch by inch and day by day. the snow retreating from the canyon floor first and then from the ravine slopes and then from the upper ledges until only the north-facing pockets held any at all. The soil that emerged was dark and receptive, still cold 3 inches down but warming faster each day as the sun came further south in its arc and cleared the canyon rim earlier in the morning. She had the seed potatoes from Albright, and the second batch of seeds she had grown herself over the winter by letting 2 of the strongest kale plants go to pod, harvesting the seeds and drying them on the bark sheets. She had the garden beds in the cave, which she was beginning to think of as a nursery rather than a final growing space, a place to start plants that could be transplanted to outside beds when the soil was ready. She had the new lamb, growing faster than she had expected, which would double her sheep flock before summer. She was on her knees in the first outside bed she had turned, a south-facing strip along the cabin wall where the granite behind it would absorb heat all day and release it through the night. Pressing seed potatoes into the dark soil at the intervals Albright had recommended, when the ewe moved to the far corner of her pen in the cave and stood against the wall in a way Vesper had learned to read without going inside to confirm. She looked at the sky through the cabin window. Clear, but with the particular high-pressure quality that sometimes preceded a late-season storm in the territory, the kind that arrived fast in April and dumped wet, heavy snow on top of the newly turned soil. She covered the outside beds with pine boughs, layering them thick enough to trap ground warmth without blocking all air movement. She brought in additional firewood. She checked the cave, checked the animals, checked the wall repairs she had made through the winter. Everything held. The storm came that night, heavy and fast, the wet April snow that weighed 3 times what the dry winter snow had weighed and pulled at the pine boughs over her beds. She went out twice in the night to shake the accumulated load off the boughs and reposition them where the weight had pushed them flat. Each time she went out, the work took less than 10 minutes. Each time she went back in, the cabin was warm and the cave was warmer. By morning, the storm had passed and the sun was already softening the new snow at the edges of the pine boughs. She pulled them back and found the soil beneath them unchanged. Protected by the thermal mass of the ground and the insulation of the branches, the seed potatoes exactly where she had pressed them, undisturbed. She stood for a moment looking at the exposed soil, then went into the cave. She lifted the lamp from the shelf and moved it along the wall until the light fell on her grandmother's initials, E.M.C., cut into the granite with patience and precision by a woman who had understood this place in 1867 and trusted that someone else would understand it too. Eventually, whenever the time came, she took the pocket knife from her coat pocket. The bone handle had come from Pennsylvania, traveled to Wyoming, passed from her grandfather to her father to her, and in that passage had accumulated the warmth of everyone who had held it and the weight of every decision they had made with it in their hands. She chose a spot on the wall to the right of E.M.C. at the same height, and she pressed the blade against the granite. The stone gave only under sustained, deliberate pressure, the way granite always does, requiring patience over force. She worked slowly, following the shape of each letter, making the cuts as clean as she could manage. The lamp held steady on the shelf. The animals breathed in their slow, settled way. The water found its way down the back wall drop by drop with the same rhythm it had kept since before either Calloway woman had ever come to this canyon. When she finished, she held the lamp up and looked at what she had made. VC, 2 sets of initials, 2 women. The same stone, the same water, the same patience with the same land. Her grandmother had cut her mark into this wall and walked away and trusted that the right person would find it when the time came. Now Vesper cut her own mark into the same surface and understood that trust was not a passive thing, not simply the belief that something might happen, but the decision to make something available to someone whose name and face you did not yet know. She set the knife on the shelf beside the tin box and the stacked bark records and her grandmother's letter and her father's 7 sentences. All of it together on a shelf of stone that had been here before any of them and would be here after. All of it accumulating the same way the thermal mass of the rock accumulated the season's warmth, slowly, invisibly, until the moment when the accumulation was enough to matter. She went out through the cabin and stood in the doorway in the April morning, the snow retreating from the canyon floor in front of her, the cliff face catching the early light the way it always did at this hour, gray going to gold from the top down as the sun cleared the eastern rim. The potatoes were in the ground. Kale was ready to divide and transplant to the outside beds that the spring sun could now reach for more hours each day. The lamb would be grazing by summer. The seep was running clean. The legal question about Section 23 was working its way through the channels that legal questions work through, slowly and expensively, in the way that most durable things take longer than immediate things but stay longer too. Companies that staked speculative claims on geological patterns understood the arithmetic of delay as well as anyone, and the arithmetic Hartwell had introduced into their calculation was not favorable. There would be word from the land office before summer. She was prepared for either outcome, which was the condition she had learned to aim for, when the outcome itself was not yet hers to determine. Thomas would return when school was out in June, and she had already begun thinking about what she could show him by then that she could not show him now, which was the outside garden in its first real season, the lamb on the grass, the creek running full from the snowmelt above. There were things she understood now about this canyon that had taken her a full winter to learn, and some of those things were the kind that transferred only by showing rather than telling, which meant she needed him to come and stand in the specific places where the understanding lived and stay long enough for it to settle. There was a cold smoker she had been thinking about for months that she could now build into the northern fissure of the cave where the draft ran consistently. There was the greenhouse she had sketched on a bark sheet in January, its back wall the heat-absorbing cliff face, its facing wall the glass she would acquire when the time was right. There were more beds to turn before the soil warmed fully. There was the crack in the south wall of the ravine she had noticed last week that she needed to walk out and examine more carefully to understand whether it was old settling or active movement in the stone. The work was never finished. She had understood this in November when she sat on the cave floor for the first time and felt the stone's indifference to the season bearing down on everything outside it. She understood it differently now, not as a sentence, but as a condition, the permanent state of anyone who has chosen to stay somewhere and build something real. It did not diminish. It organized the days. It gave them forward motion and the particular kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from knowing exactly what the difficulty is and knowing you are equal to it. She looked at the canyon stretching out before her and at the cliff face at her back, at all this granite that had been here since before anyone in her family line had set foot on the continent, patient and specific and unchanged by any weather that had moved through its particular geometry of stone. Then she went to get the spade, because there was soil ready to turn. The morning was clear, the season was moving, and the work she had in front of her was exactly the work she had chosen.